Department of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government and Public Service. I work at the Texas A&M campus in College Station, but I also am affiliated with our new teaching site here in Washington, D.C. I'd like to welcome everybody who has come to attend in person, and also like to welcome everyone who's joining us over Zoom. It's a great pleasure to be able to assemble a number of colleagues and friends who are real experts on the Middle East to talk about the root causes of the Middle East crisis. And it was a particularly lucky thing that Ambassador Barbara Bodine, the head of the Center for the Study of Diplomacy, located at Georgetown University, career Foreign Service officer, former US ambassador to Yemen, was available and willing to moderate. So with that, I'm going to turn the control of the session over to you, Madam Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. Director. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this and the opportunity to see my colleagues and friends again in person. So we're finally back to person. This is great. The basic run of show is going to be, I'm going to introduce my friends and colleagues, and then each of them will speak for about 5 minutes. I'll have some questions for everyone, and then we will also get some questions from both the audience and online. So if I read everybody's bios in full, we wouldn't have any time to talk about the Middle East. So I'm going to try to do a shorter version, and I apologize to my colleagues if I leave out something that is critical to your self-image. Dr. Gauss is, as he said, is with the Bush School, joined in 2014 and is the head of the Department of International Affairs and holds the Lindsay Chair. He was previously at Vermont, where he's professor of political science and chair of the Department of Political Science. He's also served as the director of the university's Middle East Studies program and a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Doha Center. He has his PhD in political science from Harvard and studied Arabic at the American University in Cairo and Middlebury College. His research focuses on the Middle East, as it does with everybody here, with a particular interest on the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf, which is why we know each other. He has a very long and distinguished career, a fellow for Arab and Islamic Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations, the Kuwait Foundation visiting professor at the Kennedy School, and also the American University in Kuwait, and the Faisal Center for Islamic Studies in Riyadh. Lisa Anderson is a special lecturer and James Shotwell Professor of International Relations Emerita at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. She was the president of the American University in Cairo for 5 years. And she was, before her presidency, was the university's provost. She has been on the faculty of Columbia since 1986. And prior to her appointment as dean, she served as the chair of the political science department. She's also taught at Princeton and Harvard. Her special focus is on state formation in the Middle East, regime change, and democratization. She's a trustee of the Aga Khan University, Tufts University, and the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. Member of the Academy of Arts and Sciences and also the Council on Foreign Relations. Mark Lynch is a professor of political science and international affairs, as well as the director of the Project on Middle East Political Science at George Washington University's Elliott School. His BA in political science is from Duke, and his MA and his PhD in government is from Cornell. He's also a contributing editor of the Washington Post Monkey Cage, which is something that we used to work with together, and the editor of the Columbia University Press Series on the Middle East, and finally a non-resident senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And then last and not least is Vali Nasser, who is the Majid Kaduri Professor of International Affairs and Middle East Studies. We all have such long, lovely, complicated titles. at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He was the 8th dean of the Johns Hopkins SICE between 2012 and 2019, got out just before COVID, and also was senior advisor to U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, Dick Holbrooke, between 2009 and 2011. He is the author of a number of books on the region. Probably the most famous is this Shia revival, but also the Islamic Leviathan, the rise of the new middle class, and dispensable nation. He's a member of the board of advisors of the
Blavatnik.
Sorry, I don't know very much.
It's one of these. Oh,
Anyway, it's at Oxford University.
It's at Oxford.
Oxford University, International Board of Advisors for the American University in Beirut. He has received grants from the MacArthur Foundation and the Guggenheim Foundation. A Carnegie Scholar, he got his BA from Tufts University and his master's from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Wonderful school. And his PhD from MIT. So with that, this is a very distinguished group of scholars on this region with practical experience in the region and long teaching and publication. So with that, over to the panel for your 5 minutes on why is the Middle East a mess and how do we get out of it?
I'll start. I asked my friends and colleagues to join me on this because all of us have written something recently that when I read it, I said, well, there's an answer to why the Middle East is the way it is these days. And when I wrote my piece, which came out in Foreign Affairs in the March-April edition, I considered myself to be in dialogue with these friends of mine because I had some disagreements with them about what the core reason for the sorry state of the Middle East is today. And I just want to give you the Cliff Notes version of what I think the main reason for the sorry state of the Middle East is. And that is, to me, the core of the regional crisis is the collapse or the weakening of state authority in so many parts of the Arab world, right? Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya, Lebanon, Palestine. This creation of political vacuums, in some cases, actual civil wars, in some cases, states that have a very, very hard time governing their territory and controlling their borders in any way, shape, or form. These political vacuums attract, they draw in regional and international powers, right? They facilitate terrorist organizations and groups, establishing territorial bases. They create humanitarian crises that lead to refugee waves. To me, the manifestations that we normally, or in some cases, other people have argued are the kind of the root causes of the regional crisis, like sectarianism or the lack of democracy. To me, they're symptoms of this deeper crisis of state authority. Right? Sectarianism, to me, in the region is, of course, real. People get killed because of their sectarian affiliation. This is a real thing. Right? But to me, sectarianism is a reflection of the weakening of the state. Because when the state can no longer perform the basic duties that we expect of it, right? Some minimal amount of order, right? A near monopoly on the legitimate use of force, right? The ability to provide basic services to the population. In those cases, people will run to their corners. They will run to places where they feel safe. They will run to places where those basic needs are taken care of. And in many, not all, but in many of our cases in the Arab world, right, those communities have been historically sectarian. Again, not all, right? And it's that bottom up salience, greater salience of sectarian identities that then can be exploited by outside powers, right? People representing, right? And it's natural, right? It's natural for Shia who are trying to increase their political role and their political control in places from Iraq to Yemen to Lebanon to look to Iran, the Shia power in the Middle East. It's natural for Sunnis fighting, right, in these civil war contexts to look to Saudi Arabia, to look to Turkey, to look to the smaller but richer places like Qatar and the UAE and Kuwait for support, right? These regional powers don't have to fight their way into these civil conflicts. They're invited in by the locals who are fighting, for their lives, for their community's existence. So for me, sectarianism is a consequence of the weakening of the state. Obviously, in stronger states, sectarian identity doesn't go away, but its political salience is managed and damped down by a state that can provide security, basic human needs, and also fend off the interventions of outsiders. I also think that a lack of democracy, the unrepresentative nature of so many of these Middle Eastern states is not the cause of the crisis, it's a consequence of the crisis. Obviously, it's almost tautological. If these governments were more representative, they wouldn't be having the problems that they are. But in severely divided societies, who are they going to be representative of? And I think that we've seen that elections in divided societies like Libya or in Iraq, and as we'll see in the Lebanese election, they are no guarantee of security and stability. Elections don't necessarily solve your social problems. Sometimes they can exacerbate it. And I think those of us living in this country can tell from our last two presidential elections that elections don't necessarily solve social problems. Sometimes they can exacerbate it. So to me, the weakness of the state is the root cause of the crisis in the region. And I would just point to Libya as a really good example of the fact that state weakness, right, is the thing that drives the resultant regional crisis. Because in Libya, you don't see sectarian differences, right? Almost everybody's a Sunni Muslim. But when the state collapsed in Libya, as a result of external intervention, led from behind by the United States, we see basically the same result as we see in Syria and Yemen and Iraq and other places where sectarianism plays a greater social role, right? Even though the divisions in Libya have tended to be regional or tribal, local, ideological, right? Libya doesn't look that much different than Syria or Yemen or Iraq at the height of the internal conflicts there. And so I would say that the focus, at least in terms of my analysis of why things are such a mess right now in the Middle East, is this weakening and collapse of state authority. The problem with that, of course, is that doesn't yield an easy solution, right? Rebuilding states is not an easy thing to do. And it's usually done by brutal people, brutal men in the Middle East case, right? Who have very little regard for human rights, for international norms, or for democratic practices. And I fear that that's what we're going to see in the Middle East, that if we're going to get some kind of stability, it's not going to be through political processes that we would see as good and in the long term beneficial to these places. And that means that US policy either has to do one of two things. It either has to say, as many people in this country would argue, and many people in the Middle East already think we're doing, we just have to say, okay, we're done. You guys work it out, right? But we're done. Or we have to basically accept the fact that we're going to be dealing with regimes that do not meet standards that we would like them to meet. But if we care about stability and order in the Middle East, we're going to have to deal with them. And I yield back the balance of my time in case
Thank you. I'm not sure there was a balance.
Thank you.
So following that rather Hobbesian view, Mark?
Sure. So thank you, Greg, for the invitation, and Barbara for moderating. and you all for coming. I was very gratified to see the scowl on everyone's collective face at the mention of Duke, but you guys, Coach K's gone, and you can move on. Okay, so I think that on the face of things, you might think that that Greg and I disagree sharply, because we do on a number of really critical things, but I don't disagree about the importance of weakening, failed, and otherwise shattered states. I think that if you look across the map of the Middle East right now, it's very obvious that there's a number of states that are deeply non-functional in exactly the ways that Greg is describing: Syria, Libya, Yemen, and the like. But that's only half the picture, of course, because the other half of the Middle East is made up of extremely strong, overbearing states, which are autocracies that are basically, in my view, the real driver of the problem in the Middle East, in that these are autocracies that are built on foundations, oil and US support, that have managed to stay in total control of their societies for much of their history because of their both ability and interest in preventing any kind of genuine democratic participation, respect for human rights, accountability, anything which would actually fuel genuine economic development, the emergence of citizenship in an effective kind of way, any of the sorts of things that build the kind of resilient and kind of not progressive in a political sense, but in a developmental sense, the kinds of states that I think that Greg would like to see emerge. And so in terms of what is inhibiting that, I would say that you have to point the finger at the states that are preventing, or the regimes that are preventing those kinds of states from emerging. How are they able to do it? They're able to do it because oil wealth gives them the capacity to do so. They can build these extremely strong, coercive surveillance states, which are getting stronger, not weaker. And they can depend upon the United States to support them against external and internal challengers, which has enabled them to create what is a deeply dysfunctional region before and after the 2011 uprisings. Now, the Arab uprisings of 2011 challenged that, of course, right? That disrupted everything, because it turns out that US support couldn't save someone like Hosni Mubarak, which just had to have been, and we know was, deeply threatening to every other one of these regimes. The entire purpose of the US-led unipolar system was to keep these regimes in power so that they could, basically, work with us on the things that we care about while we keep them in power. And turns out, just like we couldn't keep the Shah in power in 1979, we couldn't keep Mubarak in power in 2011. So that then, I would say, triggers a lot of the deeply disruptive and negative behavior, which you see from the surviving, quite strong regimes as they flounder about trying to find other ways of guaranteeing their survival, the survival of their regimes in a world where they can no longer count on US support, either because the US doesn't want to give it, which is what they thought about Obama, or because the United States is unable to give it, which is, I think, where they ended up with Trump and where they are now. And so when you look at what happened in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, yes, there was state weakness, state collapse, which was triggered by popular uprisings, which were in turn driven by these unmet needs, the inability to build these kinds of resilient and high capacity states. But all of those were fueled by the interventions by Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, all of these quite strong states, which then saw opportunities and threats emerging from these fallen states and collapsed regimes. They poured fuel on the fire, they competed with each other, they poured weapons, money, political support, propaganda, media. All of these things made things much, much worse. And again, the weak states are a very real component of the problem, but what makes it even more of a problem is that it's the strong states trying to find ways to stay in control that have generally made things a heck of a lot worse. And so in a sense, we look at the region right now and kind of say, okay, what is the nature of the mess and what could be done? So Greg's article in Foreign Affairs is really, really well done. It's a great article and it's very thought-provoking, but ultimately, what it points to is the solution is something like what we've seen in Egypt over the last 7 years, right? This is, in a sense, the epitome of where things, in a sense, should go. a strong leader able to reestablish control and basically prevent the emergence of the kind of societal, political, economic disruptions which 2011 brought to Egypt. And so in a sense, the gamble here is not really a normative one. It's easy to frame it as a normative one, right? I like democracy, he hates democracy, right?
Yeah.
But that's not really what's at stake.
Fair enough.
What's really at stake is more of an empirical and kind of conceptual and empirical disagreement. Is what Sisi is building in Egypt stable and sustainable, or is it not? Is what Kais Saied has done to the remnants of Tunisian democracy sustainable or not? And I think that one gamble is that, yes, it is actually. There's a long history, as Greg points out in his article, of these autocratic repressive regimes keeping a lid on social pressure and dissent, and they've done it before and they'll keep doing it. I tend to think the opposite. I tend to think that 2011 revealed that there's massive unmet demands for governance, economic development, an end to corruption, all of these unmet pressures from below, from populations that have been powerfully unserved. And we agree on that by these states. 2011, they managed to put the lid back on. By 2013, they managed to turn things around, to get their strong states back in place. But none of those drivers have gotten less, there's not less pressure anywhere. The economic conditions are significantly worse everywhere. Governance is significantly worse almost everywhere. Civil society in places like Egypt has been stripped to the bone or completely crushed, which means that much of the sources of societal resilience, which might enable these regimes to get through economic crisis, like, say, a massive food insecurity crisis triggered by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, suddenly tripling the price of commodities and energy and food, the sources of resilience are gone. So to me, I look at where we are in the Middle East right now, and I see 2009 or 2010, where everybody thinks that stability might not be good, but it's going to last, so we might as well just carry on and be good realists about it. And I look at it and I see, yeah, and 3 months later, everything exploded. And I think things are going to explode again. And so it's not so much a normative proposition of do we want democracy or not, it's is this thing sustainable? And my general reading of it is that it's not, but that's just mine.
Okay, I'm going to go to Volley and then I'm going to have Lisa talk about the economics of all of this last. So Volley?
Well, thank you. First, thanks to
Dean Nasser.
No, that was former life. Well, thanks very much, Greg and Bush School for inviting us and Barbara for moderating. And it's really great to be on this panel with friends and distinguished colleagues. I mean, I would say, and I've learned a lot from both of the articles that Mark and Greg wrote, and I kind of think about it that the complexity of the Middle East is such that we are really approaching the same problem from different angles. So I cannot really say that I disagree with them. When I read their piece, it was sometimes, yes, of course, I should have thought about and included that in my own work. And I do think that particularly Mark puts his finger on something which is very critical for policymakers more than academics, which is how to balance short and long run with what is possible in the long run and what it means to actually stop the bleeding in the short run. So I would say probably my reaction is that they're both correct. It just depends on how you look at it. And as so I would say the issue, and I want to sort of look a little bit more forward rather than just back, is that we're either at a period beginning of a really dark, chaotic, violent period going forward, which both Mark and Greg pointed to, or we're in a very messy transition period, which I think is probably the best case scenario, which is the old order is dying, we don't know what's coming, and it's particularly fraught in the middle, both because of the nature of the states and the lack of the states. And I just, as a sort of a presage to what Lisa might say, I think COVID and now Ukraine have made it a lot worse, because whatever was wrong with the Middle East economies has now gone on steroids. Markets are collapsing, food prices are rising, energy prices are rising. Europe is going to soon end up in recession, which is the main market for these places. And there is no, it's very difficult to build democracies or states in a situation of economic weakness, even if that was possible. But, I would say, if I were to think of it at a sort of a little bit more macro level about this transition period, is that what we're seeing in the Middle East is a major shift in the underlying structure of the region on which all of these are playing out. And so first of all, there is clearly an implosion of the Arab order. The way we used to think of the Middle East is dominated by Arabs, at least the coherence even among the dictatorships in terms of the way in which they managed the region. There were certain givens in the way they thought about their interests collectively. Now, half of them are broken down, and the other half that Mark points to are not what they used to be. I mean, I still don't think Saudi Arabia and UAE are really capable of carrying the Arab world the way Syria, Iraq, or Egypt did. And Egypt's just not playing the role that it did externally, that it once did. And so we're in this period where you have a fundamental change in the character of the region, and in some ways it's the non-Arab actors to some extent that matter more. So Turkey's return, it's a big player. Iran is sort of since 2003 and more effectively since the Arab Spring is a big player, and Israel has become much more diplomatically as well as otherwise aggressively engaged. So you could think of Syria as a major Arab state now being occupied in one way or the other by these three non-Arab states, Israel, Turkey, and Iran, and they are fighting to the knife among one another. So we're dealing in a way with a very different Middle East, and even the idea that power within the Arab world has shifted to the Persian Gulf itself is new and somewhat disruptive. So, Jordanians nowadays say we used to be the door to Israel. Now the door to Israel is in Abu Dhabi. Mm-hmm. We're losing our strategic value, and with it, of course, there's strategic rent as well. And these are sort of also, I think, point to a completely different way to think about the Middle East. Then, we have now under three successive presidents been talking about an American withdrawal from the region. Now, a lot of my other colleagues outside of this room keep saying, no, we're not withdrawing. That's hair split, right? Yes, there's going to be a single American soldier somewhere. But the point is, what are they going to be doing if the United States is not willing to retaliate for if it's not actually, if most of American force in Iraq is force protection force, there's Americans protecting one another sitting in Al-Assad air base, not coming out. And actually, people are not stupid. They look, we're focused on China, we're focused on Ukraine now. There's only so much military and diplomatic resources that we have. And the United States largely has been the sort of the security strategic backbone of this region. I mean, the departure of such a major, security force cannot be but disruptive one way or the other. And Middle East, I think, is the only region that actually has no regional mechanism of any sort that includes all the players. There's no OAS, there's no ASEAN, there's no Organization of African Union. It has no way in which to actually resolve its problems. So Saudis and Iranians have met 5 times and we're jumping for joy. I mean, in any other part of the world, this would have been completely routine. So in a sense, I think that's a major problem as well. That chaos has no way in which to be contained within the region. Everybody looks to the United States, and the U.S. is not playing the role that it did, either by suffocating conflict or by mediating, as it did in the past. And finally, I would say one of the important causes and going forward is the failure to deal with the Iran issue. And not only the failure to actually address it, but the fact that the Trump strategy with Iran has actually achieved exactly the opposite. In other words, had made an Iran that is much more aggressive and advanced on its nuclear program, is now completely ruled with hardliners and the security state, whereas in the past there was at least different kinds of opinions on its foreign policy. That it's now become, first, it's actually tasted blood in a way that it hadn't done before Trump. Namely, once the Iranians lobbed 100 ballistic missiles at one American airbase, they crossed the Rubicon in terms of aggression and aggressiveness. And so far, maximum pressure has not forced them out of a single territory that they've been in. I mean, it remains to be seen how that would happen. And if it does, it's going to be bloody, vicious, and quite bad. And our other colleague Ken Pollack has also written in Foreign Affairs about how the region is entering a whole dangerous new phase of arms race. And as we're talking, the Iran nuclear deal maybe has a couple months, according to people, that whether it's a go or a no-go. And one of the contentions I made that the Iranians are right now in a state of quote unquote strategic patience. So they've restrained against Israel because they didn't want to play into a situation where the talks could collapse in Vienna. But if there's no talks, the next assassination, the next bombing inside Iran may bring a much more severe reaction. They are also poised to defend their assets in Syria and in Iraq and in Yemen, and are also quite worried about the way Israel is building strategic security relations with UAE and Saudi Arabia, and are likely to react to that as well. And at the same time, again, the United States seems to be completely unfocused on this. In other words, what's driving whether there's going to be a deal or not is not whether it's good for the Middle East, but whether it's good for the Democrats in the midterm elections and for the president. So to me, the Iran factor, it doesn't explain the chaos, but it feeds on it. I mean, Iran has got into the region on the back of his state failures, and whatever Iran does, if it's in the way of trying to confront Israel and Turkey and Saudi Arabia, is not likely to be sort of a negotiated settlement about a better Iraqi government. It's going to be the opposite, as we saw, attacks on, KRGs growing and the like. So I'll stop.
Okay. All right. Lisa, you can wrap up with a much more of a closer look on the economic dimensions and dynamics that are going on.
Well, first of all, let me add my thanks to this. Part of the impulse to have this discussion is that Greg and I disagreed over our respective interpretations. And so I'm delighted to see that we all disagree. So let me just step back a little bit, because what I really want to do is to take up the challenge of a sort of, how do we understand what we're looking at? So it's not just a normative question as opposed to an empirical question, but even sort of before that, what's the sort of conceptual foundation for what we think we are seeing? So I want to suggest very quickly that I think we're in the third of three stages, perhaps there will be more, of a real kind of ongoing effort to a sort of search for what the imagined communities in this region are, and a search for a rationale for rule or for authority, all of which have seen crises and conflict, but I think it's taking a somewhat different shape now. So I will, to some extent, overstate my case, but that's what conceptual foundations do. So for the first decades, from 1948 to 1973, you had a period of state building and a lot of experimentation, by sort of looking back and saying, whatever was there before, we don't like it, and we're going to try and do something else, and so forth and so on. So obviously, you had the creation of Israel, creating in turn the perennial issue of Palestinian statehood or not. You had the United Arab Republic. You had the creation of Libya, which became independent in 1951, described by the then American ambassador as an expedient and an experiment. In other words, a lot of these countries just sort of appeared and then were contested for decades. So I think we need to remember that this sort of issue of what these states are and so forth, we tend to look at the map and say, well, nothing really changed, so there must be something there. But for a very long time, even the question of whether these were the states that anybody wanted to be living in was open. And it wasn't really resolved. So you get to the point about 1973, where I think the dynamic changes a little bit, without having resolved the question of whether these are the states we want to be living in, but thanks in part to the Cold War, thanks largely to the availability of oil revenues and so forth, you get a period of about 3 decades where the focus is not on the state so much as it is on the regime. So you have a period where the states, the music has stopped. We need regime stability. And whether it's the Cold War superpowers subsidizing regime stability, or whether it's the oil revenues coming from the Gulf subsidizes a variety of regimes in the region. State boundaries don't change, but in fact, apart from the Iranian Revolution, regimes don't change. It's really striking how there's constant conflict. The Lebanese Civil War, the Iraq-Iran War, so forth and so on. It doesn't matter. It's the same regime. So that you get this odd period, it seems to me, if you think about this historically, where the regimes don't change, and they, rather than think of themselves as governing states, because states are still somewhat contested, they tend instead to look to acquiring support not from citizens with rights, but from clienteles with privileges. So they foster sectarianism and confessionalism and kinship as bases of their right to rule, and as they're developing these kinds of clienteles. That very quickly gets out of their control, as Sadat learned. You have these sectarian groups or religious confessional groups and so forth and so on that become oppositional very quickly. But the point is that turn toward confessional and sectarian politics was partly a reflection of the interests of the regimes in finding non-citizen rationales for why anybody should support them. Because a citizen is a citizen of a state with rights. We weren't interested in that at that point. So we were going to create something else where we were beholden to people who had privileges, and of course we could withdraw them. The we, of course, is the regimes. During this time, the stability obscured a real rot in many of these countries. So you saw population increases, declining social welfare indicators. This is one of the few regions of the world where literacy declined during that 30 years period across most of the country. So this is a period where the crust, if you will, looking from the outside, it seemed very stable. But in fact, there was a lot boiling underneath that crust. You saw some of it in confessionalism and sectarianism, and ultimately that kind of impulse spilled well beyond the borders of the region, and among other things you had 9/11, which was the moment where the United States sort of pivoted in terms of regime stability and wasn't so interested in regime stability anymore. So I think now we enter the third phase around 2003, when you see the first regime change, which is not an internal process, but it is the American turning out of the Iraqi regime. And this is also a decade of the next 10 years from 2003 to, I would say, 2013 is a decade of considerable experimentation, actually, as people try and figure out whether it is possible to dismantle a state bureaucracy, and what happens. And we saw what happened in Iraq. It's very hard to construct an alternative. And we subsequently saw that all over the region. But there was a kind of radical neoliberalism that was abroad in the world and would be increasingly reflected in the region. The unhappiness that the preceding decades had caused in much of the general population, which I think Mark spoke to quite eloquently, was expressed in what we came to know as the Arab Spring. But the interesting thing about the Arab Spring is, of course, there was no institution building. These were flash mobs of fury that then couldn't organize an alternative to the regimes that they so hated, and ultimately didn't. So you saw the decades of regime stability in Libya. First Libya was an experiment. Then you saw the regime stability, and then you saw the collapse of everything in Libya. And so you now see more than a decade of a country that doesn't seem to be able to organize itself at all. So I want to argue that this has been a moment where the issue of what this is about is no longer about the states. That question was not resolved, but it was superseded by the regimes and the stability of the regimes. Now, it's no longer necessarily about the regimes, so much as increasingly you're seeing the rationale to rule and the imagined community being organized around what I'm calling an enterprise. That is to say, and bear with me here because I'm exaggerating, but I think it's an important point. Increasingly, the governments, particularly in the Gulf, but not only in the Gulf, are seeing themselves as head of private enterprises. So the ruler of, Dubai calls himself the CEO of Dubai, and Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia says he's the CEO, and so forth. So the language that they're using is designed to evoke a different rationale for why they should be in power. They're not beholden to citizens, obviously. Neither are they beholden necessarily to professional or kin-based clientele. They're beholden to shareholders. And they're going to describe what they do or describe the way they're running the polity in terms of the sovereign wealth funds, the investments that are being made, so forth and so on. So in that sense, I disagree with Mark. I don't think these are strong states. I think they're aspiring to a very different model of what politics represents. And in that sense, I'm going to push this argument probably as far as it can go. The United Arab Emirates and the Qataris are, when they had their little dust up, competitors for market share. They're seeing themselves competing all across the region for franchises. Are they going to be able to have a franchise in Libya? Is Haftar going to be able to be the Emirati franchise? Sisi's already a franchise. They're not worried about that. They've made huge investments in that, and it seems to be bearing fruit. In Tunisia, could he be a franchise? Could they ensure that he would be a kind of the same model of government that they're trying to promote? We'll see. But the point is, they're seeing themselves not in and this is hard. I think it's hard for political scientists to see it because we don't look for this sort of thing. But I think that this is, a really important change in the model or the vision of what these people think they're doing. So, if you think of it this way, they're trying to subsidize franchises, they're trying to win market share. Even the conflict between the UAE and the Qataris was very much about boycotts and price competition and supply chain disruption and so forth and so on. A lot of language that is far from the security and military world that we're accustomed to thinking about. So I think the mechanism for regional coordination here is going to be the market. That's the idea. And so the Abraham Accords fits right into this. This is a business decision, and it's a business decision that would seem to make sense to its participants. So what's the problem with this model? There's no theory for how people who are not shareholders, not consumers, not employees fit in. That's the fundamental problem. And if you're running, Qatar or you're running the UAE, it doesn't matter. Because the matter is, most of the people who live in the place that you rule are employees. But if you're running Egypt, it actually does matter. So the question of what's going to happen to the people who are not the beneficiaries of this sort of model of governance in a place like Egypt, or for that matter, Tunisia, is the really big question. Because it's hard for me to imagine as this world where, you get the new flashy administrative cities being built and the gated communities and the special jurisdictions and the private security and so forth and so on, that this group of people can share across your formal government, state boundaries and so forth and so on, everybody else is left behind. And I don't think everybody else is going to be prepared to be left behind forever. So that is the big challenge. But I think if we see it in terms of this kind of conceptualization of how politics is working, we see a different set of issues for American foreign policy. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I feel like I just watched the Middle East version of a Japanese movie. Clearly there's no disagreement that the Middle East, the region, is in absolute turmoil, and no disagreement that it's not working well for the vast majority of the people, and therefore not working well for much of the rest of the world. We didn't get into it too much, but there were indications that the US has played a role either by omission or commission in what has happened. Although I think that much of it is local and driven by local governments and local needs. Certainly the difference, this panel, I give Greg, congratulations for coming up with probably the most diverse panel of people looking at one issue that I've ever seen. On what are the root causes and therefore what is the way out. My short understanding of each of you is Greg, you have basically a Hobbesian view, and that the problem and therefore the solution is the stronger government, the more stable government. Mark I think is actually credited with coming up with the phrase, the Arab Spring, and then regretting it as it turned to winter. But looks more at stability in terms of sustainable governance, some kind of good governance as opposed to strong governance, or it will continue to bubble up. And Lisa has very much taken a look at the economic drivers and how that has shifted. And Vali has brought in all the external players, the non-Arab players in the region. So you can all tell me how I oversimplified your views and how I'm wrong, preferably later. I do think that one issue that kind of ran through all four, but perhaps needs a little bit more discussion, is the need to recognize that the center of gravity in the Middle East has shifted. That when all of us were first looking at the region and learning about the region, and when most people think of the region, they think of the legacy states of Iraq and Syria and Egypt. And those were the drivers and the players and the power for a very long time. And to the extent that there was ever an Arab League, it was based in those states. That's no longer true and probably hasn't been true for several decades. It's shifted over to the Gulf. It is the Gulf states who are now the center of gravity. Stability, however it's obtained, certainly the economic power, the center of most of the media, on and on and on. Do we need to start recalculating how we think of the region by shifting our understanding of where the center of gravity now sits? It is not in Cairo. It is not in Damascus. It is not in Baghdad. And, poor Jordan has been completely moved. So first, do we need to redefine what the center of gravity is as we're looking at root causes, as we're looking at policies going forward? The other point I would bring up is, do we need to think in a more nuanced term that the Middle East, the Arab world, doesn't exist? There are at least 3 different ecosystems: North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Peninsula states, with some outliers like Yemen. And that also part of this change in ecosystems and this change in the center of gravity is to look at who are the players and realize that so much of the Eastern Med, to the extent that they're have become pawns, that decisions aren't made in Cairo, decisions are made in Abu Dhabi and Riyadh. Decisions are not made in Morocco. Decisions are not made even in Damascus the way they were. They're now made in the Gulf. So do we need to shift the map, if you like? If I was a very good map maker, which I'm not, if you did the Middle East by power as opposed to size, you would end up with a very different looking Middle East. And then we need to recognize the Middle East as it is, not what it was.
Sure. I mean, I think each one of us probably said that in one way or another, and that's not new. I mean,
No.
but I mean, when I was a graduate student, back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, Malcolm Kerr of sainted memory for those of us who study the politics of the Middle East, came out with a book with Syed Yassin called Rich and Poor States in the Middle East, in which he was talking about how power had shifted to the countries that had oil. I think one of the interesting things that to think about, though, in the neoliberal turn, is that Turkey, not an oil country, seemed to play the neoliberal turn well, at least up until very recently. And it gave Turkey the resources to be a much more active player in the politics of the Arab world, which in the past it had kind of shunned for both ideological and strategic reasons. And so I think that there has been a real shift in power. There's no question about that. But I would also say that, and actually this one here just had a piece in Foreign Affairs about that shift and about how the region looks east instead of west now and all those things. And he's absolutely right. He was just about 20 years behind the times in writing it. But all of those protests in 2011, right, that started in Tunisia in December of 2010, they demonstrated that there still is some sense of Arab identity that's real, right? These people, right? There were millions of Iranians in the streets in 2009 during the Green Movement. You know, people in the Arab world looked at it and said, "Oh, that's interesting," and then went about their business. Right? One fruit seller in a provincial town in Tunisia sets himself on fire. And within 2 months, there's protests across the Arab world. So while I agree that power has shifted, and in fact, I wouldn't call it, some people said this is, quoting Malcolm Kerr again, that this is a new Arab Cold War. I said, no, it's a Middle East Cold War. The Iranians, the Turks, the Israelis, they're all in it, right? But the fact that Arabs still saw themselves as being much more affected by what happens in other Arab countries, I think does still indicate that there's something to that identity that remains important. Yeah.
I think it's a very important point. And then perhaps maybe 2003, when our military focus shifted very clearly to the Iraq War was the beginning of that. But I think the key interesting question is to sort of think, what does it mean? Because there is, and I think that's why Marx's piece was very good, that maps are mental. I mean, there was a mental map until recently that there is a peace process in the Middle East, and therefore that the Palestinian issue matters. And then all of a sudden, the air went out of it when with the move of the embassy and Abraham Accords, et cetera. So partly, it's a question of the way we've thought about the Middle East as to, where do we have to make sure security holds? So for a long time, it was that it has to be in the Levant between Israel and its neighbors. And then gradually, Israel really doesn't have a land threat anymore in a significant way. And all the threats became about Iraq. But, the other way to think about it is if we're not wielding the power, if we're not defining the order, where is order defined in the region, right? And that's really in Ankara, Jerusalem, Tehran, and to some extent Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. But then the power is not exercised there. The power is actually exercised in the old Middle East, right?
Yeah.
So the arenas of conflict are still, from Lebanon to Syria. And then here the question is, again, which of these powers matter more? I would say, you could look at Abraham Accords and think, UAE is in the driver, or you can look at Abraham Accords and say, no, Israel is the driver. And UAE may be one missile away from the whole corporate, structure coming under question. But I think actually understanding this is really the challenge for U.S. foreign policy. So we end up looking at the region through the old prism of things, then we're gonna miss it.
We do have the Middle East now playing the old battles with new players. And
That's right.
who's the player and who's the pawn has shifted dramatically. I would also make the point that 2003 was clearly an important shift with our invasion and complete botch up of Iraq. But I think it was also one of the points where, even though it looked like we did go in big time with our military, it may have actually been the high watermark, because to a lot of the countries in the region, we shifted from their interest to support our interest to our interest first. And when we shifted to the global war on terrorism, it was not about their stability, it was about our security. And it changed the way that we had conversations with them. And I remember just watching counterterrorism at that point. And it had gone from being a partnership, what are your concerns and how can we work with you, to it's all about us, it's our definition. And in Yemen, it went from, we want to train your forces, to we just want you to step back and let us drop drones on people. And at that point, I think that between that and Iraq, that's when the dawning became clearer that we were not there as partners with them. We were there for our own, and therefore we weren't going to be protecting them. We were going to be protecting ourselves. So I think that's got a deeper root there. Mark, everyone keeps talking about you. Would you like to talk about you?
Never. I did.
That would be a change.
Yeah. Yeah. So I agree with Greg almost completely on this question of the kind of the existence of some kind of Arab world manifested by the Arab Spring, obviously. But so the more recent article that I did in Foreign Affairs was about these mental maps and kind of rethinking what the Middle East is. And I think one of the most interesting paradoxes in all of this is that the Gulf states today, or Gulf corporations, whatever you want to call them, we'll say the Gulf states, they have never been more detached from they're not Middle Eastern states anymore in any meaningful sense. At the same time, they're more actively involved politically and militarily in the Arab world than they ever have been before. And that's a real paradox. If I look at UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia to some extent, really what you see is a node and a network connecting Asia into the core of the global north. And the transit flows, the shipping flows, the workers. They're part of a world which is centered around the Indian Ocean, India, out into China. Who buys all of their oil and gas? It's, now we're trying to bring Qatar back in with the natural gas, supplies to Germany and the like. But really, for the last 10, 20 years, there's been this huge shift towards Asia. And at the same time, if you look at where the UAE and Qatar are really active politically and militarily right now, it's the Horn of Africa and not what we think of as the Middle East. And so I said, you're right, that kind of in terms of where they're involved. And I disagree with Greg slightly about this, is that, they might have talked about this 20 years ago, but now it's real in terms of where do their interests really lie? And I don't think that their interests in any rational sense lie with the United States. They lie with China, Japan, India, and the like. And so this then, in this town, generates an enormous freak out. Oh my God, what if they depend on China instead of the United States? My general take on that is, who cares? If China and the United States basically have the same interests in the Gulf. They want to keep the energy flowing. They want to make sure there's no war that's going to disrupt everything. And we might be in conflict with China in a lot of the world, but in the Gulf, we're not in any meaningful sense. And so in a sense, that's like a way of that the reorienting of it has some real practical consequences. Now, the counter argument is, yeah, but China's been free riding on the US provision of security guarantees for 40 years. Why would that change? And to the extent that they believe that we will and can provide that security, they never will. Why should they? Why should they waste the money on having naval deployments in the Gulf or whatever if the US will do it for them? But if the US is perceived as not doing it anymore, and I think Valley is totally right about the realities there of what our military presence is becoming, then they very well might need to do what every other realist great power in history has done, develop the military capabilities to protect their vital national interests. And I think that would be a good thing.
Yeah. Well, actually, I mean, one of the things that we've been trying to do with and I think we have been trying to do with our military assistance is give them the ability to basically defend themselves mostly against Iran. The Gulf look eastward is not a new phenomenon. In fact, it goes back maybe, I don't know, 2,000-3,000 years. It was the connection. The Gulf.
I just said you
always-
were 20 years late.
Whatever.
Yeah. That always was the connection. You go to the Gulf or Yemen, you see Indian influence. It is not an they are not East Mediterranean Arab states.
Oman used to have an East African empire.
I know it did. So they did not see themselves as connected to the East Mediterranean and certainly not North Africa. Their view has always been eastward. We were a temporary fix on security and we were a major consumer. But they pivoted towards Asia long before we did. And for commercial reasons and geopolitical reasons, social reasons. The number of Gulfies whose family are in India or Indonesia is profound. So again, this is one where I don't think that we have been watching what's been going on and what the roots were. And so them looking towards India, China, Japan is not new. It's back. But how does Iran fit into this? How does the Iran-Turkey fit into this shift?
Well, I mean, partly if you looked at it from China's point of view, is the Middle East is a stopping point towards the global economy in Europe. So Iran and then Turkey are pathways to connecting China with Europe, the investments they're making in railways, pipelines, et cetera. But if on the other hand, if China or India really replace us in the region, they have a very different theory of managing security, which is you guys all get along. We don't want to play team sports. We do business with you. We do business with you. If you want our $50 billion, $400 billion investment in your strategic partnership, you behave yourself with the Gulf, and to the Gulf that you behave yourself there. I mean, there is something to the fact that our presence has led to arms race. Iranians are aggressive with UAE because they see them as clients. UAE wants that kind of protection, but I don't think the Chinese would want to necessarily play it that way. It would be to get everybody in a room and turn them into Korea and Japan, and you can hate each other, but you would do business. So I'm not sure. Not that they would succeed, but I just don't think that they look at the security imperative in the same way. And they have both India and China have relations with Iran, or have had since until we kicked them out. So it will play differently.
It would look very different. Lisa?
No, I mean, first of all, I think to follow up on that, I do think much of the world, apart from the legacy of the North Atlantic, is thinking about business, is thinking about this is what we're doing. So the Chinese are going to do business with anybody who wants to do business with them. And my Gulf, whatever they are, corporations are doing business with whoever will do business with them. And I think to try and make that shift in the way we think about what this represents for the kind of investments the United States ought to be making, for example. And so I don't think land and labor matter so much as finance anymore. It's just the way the world is. And these governments have figured that out.
Big time.
And they figured out not only that it's a way that they can exercise influence, but also that this issue of security is going to be fundamentally different. if land and labor are not as important as finance is compared to the last 100 years or 1,000 years or that. So,
But isn't oil the exception to that? I take the point that land and labor are not the sources of wealth, right, anymore, unless you have oil underneath your land.
well, I would argue that so we talk about the energy transition all the time.
Yeah.
These governments have said, we're going to be running sovereign wealth funds.
Yeah.
That's our transition.
Yes.
The oil, who cares? It'll last as long as it does and so on and so on. And who cares about solar and wind and that? We're going to be the world's biggest investors. We're going to be, the VCs of everyone. It's a way of conceptualizing what your resources are that are really not about, so that's the energy transition.
And I would agree with that because, first of all, Dubai is one of the more successful and probably one of the least oil rich.
Yeah.
They have figured out that it's not the oil, it's the money from the oil. And it's really, what do you do with that money? And the Kuwaitis started way back in the 60s with putting 10% of their money aside. Explicitly, when the oil runs out, we want our great-grandchildren to be able to live a good life. So this idea of it's not the oil, it's the money and what you do with it is well established. They're just getting much better at it, and it's the way the world economy is going. To think of them as, when I first started this, as a crouton of sand on a soup of oil, was maybe accurate way back. It is unbelievably anachronistic and distorting for us to think of them that way now. So this is, and then even looking at their interest in the Horn of Africa, it's about sea routes and it's about plantations for food security.
Yeah.
So they're thinking much smarter. We're thinking old thoughts.
Can I push back on this just 1 second now?
It's your party.
So
do what
yes, thank you.
like.
The notion of enterprises, the Gulf states, I think it captures one way that people in the Gulf are thinking about these. But these enterprise builders also think of themselves as state builders, right? MBZ wants to create citizens. He has this whole thing about creating citizens. MBS wants to create a Saudi nationalism, which I think would be about the worst thing that you can imagine for the stability of that regime. Because, right now, I think one of the reasons that Saudi Arabia was the least disrupted country, major Arab country during 2011, was that Saudis can't coalesce around, most of them see each other as more threatening than the state. And so they have kind of this mixed, very kind of globalist, sovereign wealth fund, that's where we're going to, but they also kind of think of themselves as the French Republic trying to make citizens out of a bunch of peasants. And I think that tension is real. Number two pushback. Security can come back really quick as central in the Gulf. And I think the scenario is right in front of us, right? When the talks in Geneva collapse, and when the Iranians take more steps toward weaponization, maybe not openly, but they're signaling, they're inching, they're doing this, they're doing that, then all of a sudden, not only in the region, but in Washington, there's going to be a hyper focus on security issues in the Gulf, I think. And so it's not like security goes away with these new models, because it can return in an instant as kind of the centerpiece of the agendas of all the players.
Just very quickly, first of all, although Iran is made often as the bogey, essentially the threat even to the financial success comes from one another. In others, it was UAE and Saudi who wanted regime change in Iran, in Qatar.
Yeah.
It was Saddam who invaded
Yeah.
Kuwait. And if you ask Omanis, they're a lot more worried about their neighbor next door than,
Oh,
than
yeah.
the
Yes,
Iranians.
yes,
across
yes,
the sea.
that's for sure.
That's one. The second, I think, sometimes it also reminds me of the Shah of the 70s. There's a certain ambition in the Gulf, which is not just corporate thinking. I mean, okay, Iran is a problem, but why on earth does UAE need to be an Indian Ocean blue water
Right.
power? Why does it need to sort of separate Aden from Yemen,
Right.
build these? So there
Sea
is a kind of a different kind of a state building, which is not state
Hmm.
building in terms of domestic,
Right.
citizenship.
Hmm.
It's state building in a sense of Peter the Great. They're going to be a much bigger force, and Iranians played a role very, very well here, because nobody bats an eye giving them whatever weaponry or that they need, so long as it's about Iran. And I think actually the thing is that if the nuclear deal fails, I think this will be much more an open door. So the question is, unchecked, do these CEOs have the discipline not to go down that path of spending trillions of dollars on weaponry and exactly the same thing that undid the Shah in the 70s.
There's no evidence that they have that discipline.
No, it also depends on which one, but Mark,
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, the CEO model, it kind of works in like UAE and Qatar, maybe, sure, because I mean, they have like populations the size of this room and unbelievable wealth. It doesn't really work in Saudi Arabia, as we're seeing, and that's why MBS has to go to all of this trouble. And it definitely doesn't work anyplace else in the Arab world. So suppose Sisi follows the Mohammed bin Zayed model and creates this like corporate Egypt and everything, which is clearly trying to do. And that gets a really good life with a globalized network of elites of, let's say, to be really generous and say 1 million people. What does he do with the other 92 million people? I know.
Yeah, that's her point.
Yeah.
That's her point. Yeah.
This is.
That's the limit of their thinking.
Yeah,
in the
no,
sense.
I think it's a very beguiling model
Mhm.
if you go to Davos. But if you don't go to Davos, it doesn't really work.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I do want to sort of try to wrap some of this up, and then because we're going to, I have some questions from online, and I think it's a good one that pulls your four views, where you converge and where you diverge, is the whole question of the Abraham Accords. Were not about Middle East peace, because they weren't really about anything going on in the Eastern Mediterranean. Somewhat technical, somewhat your corporations, whole series of different issues. What is the actual impact of the Abraham Accords besides PR for a number of folks? And at what point, to go to Greg's issue, if it's done for technology, if it's done for investment, if it's done for political benefits, what happens when and if it actually ends up with a security dimension?
Yeah.
So try to get your economy, I'm trying to wrap you all up into the Abraham Accords and whether or not they mean anything now, future.
So I think the long term of the Abraham Accords is a good thing. Israel becomes just a more normal country in the region. Israelis can decide whether this is a region they want to become normal in, but But I think that from the Arab side, my short view on this is that every single Arab agreement with Israel is basically an Arab agreement with the United States. I think that is the case in the Abraham Accords as well. And I think that this is minority view among most of my colleagues, but I actually think the Abraham Accords demonstrate how central the countries in the region still think the United States is. Because in each of those cases, they were making a deal with Israel in order to make a deal with the United States.
That's a really good point. I would say that at one level, they're not significant at all. UAE and Israel were already close allies and already cooperating and everything mattered. At another level, it is significant in terms of the symbolic abandonment of the Palestinian cause and basically saying, look, we're not going to be hostage to Arab identity. It kind of fits with my argument about them not really being Middle Eastern states anymore. But I think that, it could go in one of two directions. One of them is that basically UAE becomes a forward base for Israeli military action against Iran. And I think that that would go very, very badly for the UAE because they will be the first source of, if it becomes
First target.
the first target, yeah. But then on the other side of it is, if it becomes what kind of the PR says it is, which is, kind of rapidly increasing investment, technology cooperation and all of this, this is in a sense where a lot of this stuff is going, and it is significant. Now it goes very much in, what's the chief thing they wanted? They wanted the Pegasus software and more digital surveillance and everything to, facilitate autocratic rule, which is what you'd expect. But it's in a sense that's detached from the high politics, the security dimensions of it, and it gets more into just this kind of, we're going to do whatever it takes for our regime, and we're no longer concerned about these other issues. And I think that where it all falls apart is if there's a war with Iran, or if the Palestinian issue blows up again. But that could never happen. It doesn't matter anymore, right?
That's a whole other conversation.
That's another,
Whether or not
that's
there
another
is a-
panel.
It's definitely.
That's
gonna blow
another
up
panel.
again. Don't
That's
worry.
another
Whether or
panel.
not, it always blows up. Lisa or Valen, do you want to join in on that?
I think actually both these points are well taken, so I don't want to refer to them so much as to suggest that the extent to which the Gulf countries are not Middle Eastern states, they're putting a lot of money into Tunisia and Libya and Egypt and so forth and so on. So,
And then eventually Syria.
yeah, I do think, and in some respects, as the Hariri family showed, you can make a lot of money that way. So maybe this is just really a vision of, when there are going to be investment opportunities, we're going to be the first people there. But I do think that there's still something that draws these countries back to the old Arab world, if you will. So that I think we need to just keep in mind. And on the Abraham Accords as well, again, I think these are well taken points. I just think one of the things that I don't see us collectively, and certainly I can't follow very effectively, is the subterranean private security world. And I just think there's a whole world there that is part of those arrangements that are to some extent bypassing the kind of conventional American military strategy and so forth. And there's something in behind there that I can't see, but I think it's going to turn out to have been very good.
Yeah, I think the private security used by both the Israelis and the Emiratis in particular is going to be something hard to watch, that needs to be watched because it's going to be very dangerous. I agree with you totally.
Just to add, I don't think UAE money is really material for Israeli technology sector. It's already awash in money. It really doesn't need their investments. And I think a lot of these things they could have purchased really without necessarily the Abraham Accords. The key question for me is that, what's in it for Israel? Okay, the first level is that you got 4 Arab countries to recognize you, but then what now? So one scenario is exactly what Mark said, which is that they're going to begin to push to use Abraham Accords as a jumping ground against Iran, which then is going to basically put these Arab countries in a jam. Benefit number 2 is that they would actually try to get more Arab countries to join. I actually don't think the Saudis will. Saudis are not going to join any deal that was led by UAE. They're going to have their own. But there is pressure on Jordan. There's pressure on Pakistan, on Egypt, despite their own bilateral deals to join this. But those second set of countries coming in don't have an issue with Iran.
Yeah.
So then the Israelis have to decide which way they want to take this. Do they want to make it really about Iran, in which case they really don't want Jordan, Egypt, Pakistan in, or they want it about normalization in the region, that the maximum number of countries will be joining, in which case that then it cannot be about Iran. So I think the decision is theirs.
Right now they have 4 states, but it's the Emirates who have a long-standing, sometimes murky relationship already. Bahrain Sudan, which signed up in order to get off our terrorism list, and Morocco, which signed up in order to get the Western Sahara.
Right.
So everyone is at this party, for a different reason, not very much of which has to do with either the Palestinians or Iran. And a little bit goes back to your point that it was all about us, but it was us being able to say that we had this wonderful
That's right.
peace process that
Mhm.
has nothing to do with the two major conflicts. So it's an interesting peace process.
Yeah.
Why don't we, I've gone through many of the questions from before. So any questions in the audience, one in the back and then Tom.
And so if you could just give your question, but Barbara will repeat it so the folks on Zoom can hear.
We've been discussing Iran. Recently, Assad was in Tehran to meet with Khamenei. What do you think they were discussing?
Okay, the question is, what were Assad and the Iranians discussing in Tehran?
Yeah.
Almost everybody's been going to Tehran recently, so this is one of many conversations.
I think the more interesting visit that Assad made recently was to the UAE.
Yeah.
Because that is a signal that at least the UAE has decided that Assad is around and they're going to have to deal with him. I would imagine that in Tehran, Assad was discussing the things that he would always discuss in Tehran. How can we keep my regime in power? And what's the price the Iranians will ask for that?
Well, I agree. I mean, first of all, it was a symbolism in response to the argument that somehow UAE and others are pulling Assad away from Iran. So it was a way of
a 30-year project of the Gulf states,
that's
which
right.
has failed.
That's right. So that's not happening. But interestingly, at least the only part that they put out that they discussed at length the Palestinian-Israeli issue, which suggests that the Gulf wants to make it all about Iran. Iran is basically saying we're going to make it all about
Palestine.
Palestinians.
Yeah.
Thank you all for a very thought-provoking discussion. I'd like to ask if it is possible that all these, what you might call semi-theoretical discussions about state structure and regime are not going to become irrelevant for another force entirely. I don't recall the last time I heard the word Hobbes 3 times in 45 minutes. But I'd like to offer a different British philosopher named Malthusian. There's not going to be enough food and water to sustain the population, no matter how much cash is in the treasury. You know about the desertification of Iraq, my example is Egypt, which has twice as many people as it did when I lived there and less arable land. And when the Renaissance Dam is filling, look out below in Egypt, literally. And so I wonder if it's not possible that whether you're talking about corporate states or autocratic states or even democracies, imagine that, we're not facing some kind of event in which that none of them are actually capable of dealing with.
Okay, the short version of the
Right.
question, if I can, is rather than, or if not instead of Hobbes, at least in addition, Malthusian issues of food. And just a quick intervention on my part, we have always seen US policy in the Middle East driven by oil security. You go back to the Carter doctrine and it's all about the free flow of oil. That's been a mantra for decades. You flip it and you want to look at what drives the Emirates and the Saudis to look at the Horn of Africa or Egypt or anything else. They are driven by food security in ways that we used to be driven by oil security. And if I remember what I read in Mark Lynch's book about the Arab Spring, it was as much driven by the rise in food prices as it was by a sense of, I want democracy. So food has driven and continues to drive these states' definition of national security priorities. If you can't feed your people, you will have revolt.
Well, I would just very quickly, I would just say that this is a place where climate change is not an abstract thing. I mean, if you look at temperatures in the Gulf and Kuwait, good Lord, desertification, wiping out, the drought is like absolutely wiping out Iraqi agriculture, Iranian too, for that matter. I think you're totally right, Tom, to focus on this. I think that like the high capacity wealthy states in the Gulf, they'll figure it out. I mean, so like when Qatar is blockaded, oh my God, we can't get yogurt. Let's go and like import a bunch of cows and make our own yogurt, and then we'll sell it for a profit, right? Then they'll be fine. But the ones that won't be fine are Egypt, Iraq, and Algeria, and like these large population, low capacity states that are completely unable, and we're seeing how unable they are to meet the challenge that climate change is driving. So it's not just food security, it's that the pressures on food security are growing dramatically.
When I say food security,
No,
I'm talking
I
about
agree
that.
with you. I
Yeah,
totally
yeah.
agree with you.
Okay.
And I-
Yes, please.
Well, I'm gonna be even more
Malthusian.
miserable. This region now has the worst inequality in the world.
Mm.
So it used to be Latin America, we
Right,
always laugh
right.
about the Latin Americans and so forth and so on, and say, the good thing about the Middle East is that it was relatively egalitarian. It is now the least egalitarian region in the world by far, and not just because of the Gulf countries, this is within country too. So the richest Egyptians are living as if they live in the Gulf, and the poorest Egyptians are living miserable lives already. The issue that worries me is, I don't think very many of the people who are in a position to do anything about it care. When you have that kind of inequality, you have a world where the people are living in gated communities, flying, and I'll give you an example. I mean, this isn't really fair, but there were lots of students at the American University in Cairo who lived in a gated community, had never been to Tahrir Square, never been downtown, and who were as quick to go to the airport to go to Paris as they were to go to anywhere in Greater Cairo. That's not typical, but it's not atypical either. So my concern is that many of these kinds of problems, which would, one hopes, actually worry a government in a place like Egypt, or once you're used to living next to Libya, you can imagine being gated, having, your private security and so forth and so on. You're going to begin to look like what we used to say Brazil looked like. Everybody has their private armed guards out in front at the gate of the villa and so forth and so on. I don't imagine a world much different from that. So I actually do think immiseration is going to continue. And I think what's interesting is that a lot of the wealthy in this world are now preparing themselves to live by not noticing that.
Well, we're really getting on a happy note here.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. We've got about 5 minutes to wrap up the Middle
To
East.
say something cheerful.
To say, no, I did not say to say something cheerful, but at least to try to see something forward looking. First of all, I think one question is, do you define US engagement by the number of boots on the ground? And I guess I would say that maybe that's a previous era, and we need to think, how do we engage? And not militarily, that started in 2003 and it hasn't worked well for just about anybody. How should the US engage? How do they want us to engage? And understanding these are not colonies, protectorates, but now mature states. How does the US have a Middle East policy that is constructive when it is no longer determinative?
I think we have to pick our spots. I think that there was an atmosphere of hubris and dislocation after 9/11, the hubris from the victory in the Cold War and the dislocation from 9/11. And we really thought that we could remake the region. And that was an act of hubris that came a cropper, just like in the Greek tragedies. But I do think that we can't help rebuild state authority, which I would say is the is the sine qua non of solving any of these other problems, or at least making progress on them everywhere. But I think that we should pick the places that look to be the most important for our intrinsic interests, which I still think to a great extent revolve around oil. And thus, I would say Iraq, not Libya, not Yemen, not Syria, Iraq. If we're going to help rebuild authority, right? If we're going to atone for our sins, right? We have to do what we can to help the Kazemi government build on what I think are some somewhat positive steps that it's taken. Maybe I'm being too optimistic.
Are there any other views besides putting all of our eggs in the Iraqi basket and building up a nice, strong government? Any contrary or?
Iraq, I mean, okay, it's really easy to lay all of this on the Bush administration. They were terrible, it was a disaster. But, you know, before the Bush administration, we had Iraq under sanctions for 12 years.
Yeah.
Killed untold numbers of people, eviscerated the country. You know, why were their institutions so weak and hollowed out? Because of 12 years of sanctions.
Yes.
So it's not like this began only, I mean, again, I'm as critical of the invasion of Iraq as anybody else, but there's a longer history. I mean, I think that the US role in the Middle East is an artifact of this extraordinarily unusual moment when the Soviet Union collapsed, and we took advantage of that to impose an order, which has for the most part been bad for the United States and bad for most of the region. And if it passes, as the last 3 presidents have all wanted to see happen, I think that would generally be a good thing for the United States and for the people in the region. I probably should not be allowed to live in Washington anymore, but.
Oh, that's okay, but I think we're still defining engagement solely in terms of military security. And first of all, we had a lot of engagement in the Gulf before 2003. And that is, I think, a very narrow one-trick pony idea about how we engage and why people engage with us. So maybe the first thing is that we need to take a broader definition of what engagement means as opposed to boots.
Right.
These are and volley both.
I mean, I think one of the issues, as you pointed out, is that we obviously have thought about the region largely in military terms or support for authoritarian regime, which is again about security. I think we have to come to terms with the fact that we're not going to be spending much time there. And actually, it's good for the region to develop some degrees of mechanisms for internal consultation, working, et cetera. I mean, we have zero, let's say, investment in trying to even create the modicum of these sorts of institutions. And I think the region at least will benefit to some degree if there are ways in which some of these issues, economic, climate, water, security, can be discussed and managed locally.
Or discussed and managed at all.
Okay.
Yep.
I mean, I agree. I think we have defined American interests very much in security terms. We have virtually no commercial relationships with anybody except for oil. Nothing. And, you know, when you think about, I say to my students, you know, look at the labels of the clothes you're wearing and where your food is coming from. We know a lot about Vietnam because we wear clothes that are made in Vietnam and Bangladesh and all sorts of places like that. We have nothing like that. We don't have anything comparable to those kinds of relationships and investments. And I'm not saying it's a good thing to exploit labor and textile factories, but at least you have an interest in what's going on there that we don't have that kind of interest. And I just think it means it's much easier to be cavalier than it would be if we were actually importing Egyptian cotton and making things out of it and wearing it and thinking, I wonder who made that.
Or even better, having the Egyptians make those things and import.
I guess I would just say that for too long, at least in the Gulf particularly, the relationship was built on oil and security. And oil is less important to us now, but not to the rest of the world. And our security umbrella was always had a lot of big holes in it anyway. And it was all focused on oil. So I think we have put ourselves in a corner where we too narrowly defined our interests and we too narrowly defined what the relationship was based on. And as one has gone away, the other one was, and they've kind of gone away together. And perhaps what we need to do is rethink what is the nature of the relationship? What are the forms of engagement? And from that, what are the tools we have to have something that looks like a normal relationship as opposed to a client relationship or a customer relationship? And I don't think we've quite gotten there yet. We're still thinking in the 1990s to 2003, and we have not recognized how these states have grown and changed, how their interests have grown and changed, and where we fit in. And we can't make it great again.
Yeah.
And on that happy note, any conversation on the Middle East always ends up, at least with gallows humor or something. I want to again thank Greg for putting together this fantastic panel and for all of the scholarly work that you all have put into, the deep thought that you all put into these issues. And to the Bush School, welcome to Washington.
Thank you. Which is named after President George H.W. Bush, not
Just to
President
be,
George
yeah,
W.
just for
Bush.
everyone to
Yeah.
be very clear
Yeah,
about
yeah,
that. No, but thank you. Welcome to Washington.
Thank you.
For the panel, and always
Thank
good
you.
to see my colleagues and friends and to hear your wisdom.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being with us. Thank you to all of you on Zoom, and
Have a good afternoon.
have a good afternoon wherever
Yeah.
you may
Yeah.
be.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Great job.
Thank you, Barbara.
It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, that was a good panel.
I'll tell you if you need to apply.
And that's exactly what I wanted to have, fun.
Oh, it was really.